On this day, 10 years ago, The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim was released. I played the heck out of that game and revisited it several times in the years after, and it's actually getting a revisit this year with a brand new anniversary edition. But beyond the game just being really fun to play, it actually holds a special place in my heart as one of the sort of catalysts for Maker's Muse as a YouTube channel. You see, I got my first break on YouTube sharing my technique for ripping game assets from video games like Skyrim and 3D printing them. And way back in 2014, 7 years ago, yeah, time flies, I made a tutorial video on how to do just that with Skyrim. So I thought it'd be really fun to go back to my roots and share with you guys my brand new and updated method for ripping game assets from Skyrim for 3D printing and how you can add detail back into those assets to create some absolutely incredible 3D printable models. Let's get started.
Hey, you're finally awake.
Okay, so what are you going to need? Well, first things first, you're going to need Skyrim. Obviously. So the original version is the best one to use for this sort of thing because all of the tools that I know of work with it. There's been various versions across the years since, like Special Edition and now the latest Anniversary Edition, but I can't promise that the tools I'm going to show will work for that because a lot of them haven't been developed for years. But I do know that they will work for like Fallout 4, Fallout 3, New Vegas, and that sort of thing because those are quite old games based on the same game engine as Skyrim. Anyway, so if you don't have the original version, you can actually get it really cheaply by getting a Steam key from another market. Like I've used Fanatical before, and you can get it quite cheap. I actually have the game on my Steam library from years ago anyway. But to follow this tutorial with its current tools and their current state, you need the Special Edition or below, and it might work on the Anniversary Edition, I'm just not too sure. But for full compatibility, the original game is really what you're after. Then we need Nifskope. So Nifskope, made by Nif Tools, is awesome. I used it in my original tutorial, and that lets you go into the game archive and pull out the Nifs, which are the 3D models, the format that the game uses. And you can export them as an OBJ to then be modified and then repaired for 3D printing. I also have a Blender plugin, but this only works with the original Skyrim, and I don't find it super useful because what I just do with the OBJs if I want the textures is I'll go in and get the textures from the texture archive and then combine them myself, and Blender takes it in with no problem. So you might have better luck than me, but yeah, you can get the Nif plugin, but basically Nifskope is what we want. Windows 10 3D Builder. So yes, you do need Windows 10 to get Windows 10 3D Builder, but it is hugely powerful for repairing meshes. And it's replaced what I used to use, which was the Netfab cloud service. That's no longer available because if you go to it, it says Autodesk has it built into Fusion 360. And unfortunately, it's also replaced Mesh Mixer, which used to be my favorite program of all time because that also got gobbled up by Autodesk and its features stripped off into Fusion 360, and there's been no development since on Mesh Mixer either. I still use Mesh Mixer now and then, but for repairing meshes, 3D Builder is the way to go. It repairs them much cleaner and much better than Mesh Mixer ever could. And again, it's free. You just need a copy of Windows 10. If you're just going to pull out the files, repair them, and send them to the printer, then that's all you need. But if you want to do any sort of additional work to them, then you're going to also need the Bethesda Archive Extractor that lets you open up the archives beyond just the meshes, because Nifskope will open the mesh folder, the mesh archive, but it won't let you open the texture archive. So you need the Archive Extractor for that. And then Blender. I am a Blender neophyte, but it has come along so far in recent years, and it's such an incredibly powerful program for free. It's crazy, so it's worth learning. And if you have just an ounce of skill when it comes to organic 3D modeling, pick up Blender and give it a go, because it now has a dedicated sculpting workflow next to the dedicated modeling workflow. You can render it, you can animate in it, you can do so much in it, and I'm just going to do some really basic stuff in it. But yeah, you can take these assets into Blender, and like I'll show later on, one of my mates did, turn it into a fully detailed sculpt based on the original game asset. You're almost using it like a 3D image and reference with the original game textures. So this is all the software you need. Let's move on to the first stage, which is Nifskope. Alrighty, so here we have Nifskope, and you want to use Nifskope to navigate the archives and pull out the meshes you want and convert them from a NIF into an OBJ, which then you can do all sorts of things, fix them for 3D printing, or take them further with 3D modeling in Blender. So what you're going to do is File, Browse Archive, and you'll find your mesh archive file in your Steam folder under Steam Apps, Common, and then navigate down to Skyrim, and then Data, and then under that you'll find the BSA archive files, and we want meshes. So the later versions, like Special Edition and that, will have several archives for meshes, but the original game only has one. So just you can navigate through them one by one, finding the stuff you want, pulling it out, and then you can go through them later. So there's heaps of things in here, heaps of meshes. Some of them are useful, some of them are less useful. But basically, where I recommend starting is the load screen art. So these are interesting posed 3D objects that show when the game's loading in. So for example, like brown bear, or one of my favorites, this one with Alduin sitting on the wall. So I will save that off. So File, Export OBJ, and it pops up this little message. That's fine. And then I'm going to save that off. There's quite a lot of interesting models under architecture. So you can go to architecture and then, for example, like farmhouse. And I look for the models that have the higher file size. That means more polygons, so that means they're more detailed. There's more stuff to work with. So like, for example, farmhouse. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. What about this one? That's another farmhouse. And farmhouse destroyed. But you can also navigate to notable buildings. So, for example, Whiterun. You can go here, Whiterun buildings. And you can look through here, like, for example, the Whiterun Breeze Home. I want that. So I'm going to export that one. And your Vasker is massive. and clearly will need some repair work, but pretty cool. You can pull that out as well. And then, of course, we have weapons. So if you're interested in cosplay, this is a great place to start. So I really like the Daedric stuff. So there's different, like, grades of models. There's ones that are, like, designed for the first-person view and ones that are designed for other views. And they'll be different quality. So make sure, again, choose the ones with a higher file size. Although, they're still very low polygon. So you've got, like, a battle axe here. Daedric dagger, pretty cool. Warhammer. All of these are really funky, but I really like the dagger. It's really, like, I printed the dagger originally in my original tutorial, so I'm going to file and save that one as well. And that's going to be a good example to show you the quick and easy method of repairing it in 3D Builder. So navigate to the folder you've saved your OBJs to, and you'll notice there's also a material file for each one. We'll get to that in a little bit. But right click and then open with 3D Builder. So it does complain if it can't find all the textures that it needs, and that's okay because we're fixing it for 3D printing, so we don't care about textures, so just click ignore. And then there's scales. So with the game files, the game assets, it's just an arbitrary scale. It doesn't really make sense for the real world. So I import as millimeters, but you might want to play around with that. Doesn't matter, you'll have to scale in your slicing software to get it to the size you want anyway. But here, so you notice there's a red bounding box around it, and it says down here, one or more objects are invalidly defined. Click to repair. So it identified that this object is not ready for 3D printing, and it needs to be repaired. That means it's not manifold. There's going to be intersecting faces, gaps, shells and stuff, so when you want to 3D print an object, it needs to be manifold. Imagine you're filling it with water. And needs to fill the inside of the shape. That's what the slicer's kind of trying to do. It's trying to figure out what parts of this basically zero thickness surfaces should actually encompass a object, a volume, and then it's going to print that. So what you just need to do is click that pop-up box, and as quick as that, it's fixed this model. And that's because it's very low poly and it's not too broken, but this is ready to print now. So you can just basically go, okay, I'll save that off. You can save as a 3MF, but I still just generally save as an STL. And here it is brought into Prusa Slicer. So again, the scale, it's tiny, but we can just like scale it to whatever you want to fit to your print volume. And then you can do whatever you want to it. You could slice it up for printing in parts to print larger or print it better. Or you could then add support material, do some modifications, and then, yeah, print this out and you have a real world replication of the in-game object. Now and then you'll come across models that don't auto-repair well. So for example, I have this wall here, This is completely zero thickness and non-manifold. These meshes the triangles have no thickness, so it needs to be repaired to be printed. But if I try to repair it in Windows Builder, it doesn't do a good job. It's got these weird gaps here, and like the triangles all look crap. It's not right. So I'll show you how to do some basic repair work in Blender for stuff like this, when you want to just cap off areas really quickly and easily. So here we have the same wall in Blender, and what I want to do is I'm going to use the modeling workspace. You hit A to select all the triangles and everything, but I don't want to do that. Actually, I want to just select the edges. So on your keyboard, 1 is the vertexes, 2 is the edges, and 3 are the faces. So hit 2, and that's going to be your edges. And if you hold down Alt while you click an edge, it will select a edge loop. And the whole purpose of this is we want to patch off these areas. But if we try to patch this off, because it's actually selected the entire open edge loop by pressing F, it does exactly the same thing that 3D Builder did. It doesn't patch it very well at all. So in that case, we can kind of help it along by doing a bridge in one area and then patching off 2 different areas. So I'm going to select this edge here, hold down Shift, and just select this edge, and then press F. And then hold down Alt, and then select this edge, which selects the edge loop in this area now, so it's been walled off. Press F, and we get a really nice flat surface there. And then finally, for the bottom, hold down Alt, select this edge, press F. Now what we've done is we've made this object manifold, so it's going to be watertight, and it's perfect for 3D printing, but it looks much, much better than what the auto repair did. And here in Prusa Slicer, you can see the results. So the wall that we didn't do anything to, still not very suitable for printing, and the wall that we've patched off and made manifold for 3D printing. And if you slice them, it's pretty obvious which one works. So you can do that really quickly. Once you get the hotkeys and the workflow down, you can patch a lot of things really, really fast if they're simple like that. And the auto repair just isn't doing it for you. Alright, so the low poly look is okay for some models, but let's say you just really want to have a bit of smoothness and detail to your prints. Well, you can do it 2 ways. One is really easy, and the other is incredibly difficult and needs 3D modeling skill. So I'm just going to show you the easy one first, because that's what most people are going to do. And here I have that Alduin model from the loading screen art. I've got it in 3D Builder, and the reason I have it here is I'm going to fix it before I do anything to the mesh, because what I've found is if I don't fix it first, the fixing afterwards gets really difficult. So I brought it into 3D Builder, and it's going to click Repair, and it's going to repair my low poly mesh very quickly by basically capping the bottom off and then joining it all together, making it manifold. So I'm going to save this. I'll just save it as an STL, that's fine. And then I'm going to open it up in Blender. So I'm going to go Import, STL, and I'm going to grab my recently saved STL, which I've fixed. The first thing you'll notice is it's massive and not loading in properly. You can't view it right. That's fine, you can change the scale, so just click it and then click Scale. And then here on the right hand side, I'm just going to make 0.2. It doesn't really matter, but that way we can manage it a bit easier. So if you see this mesh looking like this, right, don't get excited and think it's magically high detail. This is just a viewing rendering mode, which is smooth rendering, but you actually want to shade it flat to work on it properly, because that's how it will be reproduced in the real world. So again, smooth, that's not actually what it is. Shade flat, that's actually the triangles. That's actually the low poly mesh. But we can add a bit of smoothness to it using subdivision. So you want to click the blue gear on the right hand side, and we want to add a modifier. So we're adding a subdivision surface modifier. And this is just from one pass of subdividing, and it's already so much better. So we can add more to it if we want. The higher you go, the more load it puts on your CPU, and the more triangles it produces. So there's definitely a diminishing returns. But already there at 2, I think it looks great. So the thing about subdivision is you will lose sharp edge definition. So here, for example, it's going to start rounding that over. These details here, it's going to start rounding them over, which is not fantastic. And the base as well, it will start sort of rounding that over. If you don't repair the model before going in, you can avoid some of that, but then it takes ages to try to repair it afterwards because you have all these like weird gaps and stuff left after the subdivision. So up to you, but I prefer to repair before going into Blender. So now I've done that, you'll notice that there's a lot of details that are really thin. Like the teeth and the wings, for example, are super thin too. So I want to add some thickness to it. I'm going to do that using a displace modifier. So add modifier, displace, and all this is doing is simply taking the mesh and pushing it out, or in if you want, by a certain amount. So that's 1. Let's see what 2 looks like. Looks pretty good. What about 3? 3 is pretty chunky, but if you're printing it on a 3D printer, you need to make it actually physically reproducible. But 2 looks okay. So I think 2 is pretty good. And with just those steps, I've gotten away with adding a lot of detail to this mesh, making it look really cool, with only a few interesting weird artifacts, like the wings are a bit odd. And there's a few weird things going on here, but overall, not too bad. And as an example of that, here I have a pressure slicer with the resin workflow, and this is the file we just made, brought in. And from here, you can, hollow it out, you can add supports, change the orientation, and prepare it for 3D printing on your preferably resin 3D printer, because it's quite high detail. I don't think you could reproduce this easily on a filament 3D printer, unfortunately. But what if you really want to add detail to these models, like make them look as good as the real thing? Well, unfortunately, you need some organic 3D modeling talent to do it. You can use the textures in the game to displace into the mesh after subdivision and fixing, but you will have to go in manually and model in detail because it's just not good enough to bring them from the game to reproduce in the real world. But I'll kind of show what to expect, and I'm going to defer to my friend over at Valtech VR, who is an incredibly talented 3D modeler, on his process of converting these game files into incredible 3D sculpts using a full combination of these techniques. But before you start, you need the textures to go with your exported OBJ. So when you export the OBJ out of Nifskope, you have a materials file. So what I'm going to do is right click, I'm going to do open it up with Notepad++. And what this does is just show me what textures it's expecting when it wants to open up. So you can see that the Alduin from the loading screen wants this rigged stone 7, load screen ruined door, load screen door, dragon room alphabet, blah 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 blah. We need to go and find these textures, and that's why we need the Bethesda Archive Extractor, because that will open up the texture archive where we can go and navigate and find these textures. So with the Archive Extractor, you just go to File, Open File, and you want to navigate again to your Steam Apps folder, and then you want to open up your Textures archive. But this will open up any of the archives, so you can find like the dialogue and the sound effects and things in here. It's really, really cool if you want to play around with them. But yeah, just for this, we just want the Textures archive. And then if we go back to the Materials file, we want to find out where these are stored. You can export all of the textures, but it's a lot, but it can make finding them easier if you want to do this sort of thing a lot. But for example, I just paste it in, it finds them here, because there's a few different variations. I'm just going to export all of them. So you go to extract, and it'll just export them out under these folders, which is exactly what we want, because you can see here it's calling for the texture under textures, dungeons, and then the name of the texture. And then we go back to Blender and go to File, Import, OBJ, and then make sure everything is in the correct folders. So I've got here, and I've got the texture folder there, and then import. And if you pray to the appropriate Skyrim god, then it should work. If I click texture, there you go, just like that. The scaling again is completely off. It's way too big. So I'm just going to scale it down again. But again, don't forget, this doesn't magically have more detail suddenly. It's still low poly, it's just got the textures on it now. So what we can do again is we can do a subdivision, but then we can use these textures to actually add real texture, real 3D data onto the model. It's very hacky, and you do need to do a lot of cleanup normally to the mesh to make it work better, but I'm just going to do it really quickly here to show you kind of an idea of what to expect. So I'm just going to go to the modifier. I'm going to do a subdivision, and I'm going to do 4 levels of subdivision, which is going to be very intensive on the CPU, but adds so much triangles, so much detail that hopefully when we do the displace, it should look a little bit cleaner. Now you've done that, you can go to deform and displace. And the idea is to get one of the textures that's been UV mapped to the geometry and then displace that to add detail into the model. So down here, texture properties, we're going to go to new, and then we're going to do image or movie, and the image will be one of the textures that we've got. The problem is, I'm not sure which one to use. I'm going to go with this one. Probably should have chosen a simpler model to start with. It actually looks pretty cool as is, but that's not correctly mapped. You want to go back to displace, and the coordinates will be UV. Now it has done something, but it's not really obvious. So with the strength, I might increase that, maybe 3. And it is doing something, but it doesn't look fantastic. Maybe small, it'll look okay, but it kind of looks like pixelated. But it does add a lot of interesting texture to a fairly bland geometry. So the whole idea of this, you take this and then you model in the detail further. And that's why you should go watch my friend's tutorial right here, because he is a genius when it comes to this. I don't like doing organic modeling myself. So I can't personally take this sort of thing any further, because I just don't have the talent for it. But he can. So if you want to do this sort of thing, if you want to push your models even further and you want them to look absolutely insane, go watch his video. So here are some of the things I've printed out of Skyrim, starting with this Daedric sword. So I originally printed this on the CR30 for that review. It's a belt 3D printer, so it works in a really interesting way. The gantry is at an angle, and it has a belt which feeds the print forward layer by layer. So it's actually printed only in 2 halves stuck together to create this humongous sword, which is way bigger than any normal 3D printer could produce. Unfortunately, I did drop it and broke the end of the pommel off the sword. But if you're into cosplay and that, you can rip game assets like the weapons straight from the game and produce them large, or, if you like, small. So these tiny little weapons were printed on the Prusa SL1S. Again, I reviewed that very recently. And these, again, were just ripped from the game and fixed using 3D Builder out of Windows 10. Didn't do any subdivision, I didn't do any 3D modeling to get detail back up, because at this scale, they don't really need it. They look really good as is, and some of them are quite complicated, like, this mace, Morg's mace, I believe. And then some of them are quite simple, but just quite elegant, like this tiny Mehrunes razor, which is more like Mehrunes toothpick. So these can be really, really fun, scaling them down for your scale model adventures. And I sort of thought to myself, well, if I'm doing that sort of thing, scaling them down for like D&D, then what about the architecture in Skyrim? What about those assets? What do they look like when you rip them and 3D print them? So that's what these walls are. They're just ripped from the BSA archive in the architecture folder. And I think these are the ones from around Whiterun, I believe. So again, these are fairly low poly, like all the models in the game. But instead of subdividing it, I just left it as is. And I used Blender to cap it off, to seal it for 3D printing so it's fully manifold. And when these are scaled down, they have a really nice look to them. I reckon if you're interested in D&D and that, getting these little assets and then using them to form a sort of playing field, like a map, could be really, really cool, because even though they're low poly, they look quite good. And you can have your little figurines like this around, and it really adds depth and detail to whatever campaign you're running. Then of course I just had to print myself a breeze home as well, because I'm not going to pay 5,000 gold for that. Again, this is just the original mesh. It hasn't been added to, subdivided, or modeled any further than what it was, so it is low poly, but when you print it small like this, it actually suits the FDM/FFF 3D printing process quite well. If you're going to print in resin, yes, you might want to add detail back in, because resin's capable of reproducing it, but for FDM like this, it actually has a really nice little look to it, and I think a lot of those assets are really useful to be reused in game design for your Dungeons and Dragons campaigns and that sort of thing. One of the biggest issues with the models that you rip is they're not posed. So what you'll often get is, if you get a character, they'll be in a T-pose like this, and that's designed to be rigged and then animated in the game itself. But I found out early on that the loading screen meshes were posed in interesting dynamic ways, and then they were saved like that. So what I have here is the Alduin dragon from the loading screen. And it's a really, really good model to then rip and print because everyone knows the dragons from Skyrim, especially Alduin. And I just really wanted to create this for myself because I've always wanted it from the game. However, if you are skilled at organic 3D modeling, you can take these meshes and then add detail back in using the UV maps to, for example, displace some areas and then model in detail yourself manually. And if you're skilled at that, you can turn these meshes into incredible 3D prints. This is a dwarven bust that one of my mates did. So he took the mesh from the game and then fixed it up in Blender and then modeled in detail himself within Blender. And then I just printed it out on the Frozen Sonic Mega 8K. The detail is phenomenal. It looks so, so good. And it's like using the original meshes as a very strong reference, like a 3D reference that you then add detail in. Because again, the original game assets aren't designed to do this. They're designed to be light on your system, so then you can sort of artificially make them look curvy and have texture using bump maps and the UV maps and all sorts of fancy trickery, which I don't really quite fully understand. But that's why the game assets are low poly by default. If you want stuff like this, it is quite a lot of extra work to get it to this point. He spent several days adding detail back in manually, but if you want to do this and that sort of thing excites you, it's a really good starting point to know how to pull the assets out of games and then use that to create your own versions of those models. I do find it a little bit odd that even now, like 7 years after making that original tutorial on ripping files from Skyrim, there hasn't really been much progress in the field. They sort of seem to run separate to each other. The modding community, 3D printing community doesn't seem to collide very often. And one of the questions that was brought up back then, which I still don't really have an answer for, is this legal? So you buy a computer game, right? Of course, like you can play that computer game, but the licensing, does it cover printing out the models from that computer game? I'm not too sure. My default's always been, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but my default's always been, I don't think it's okay to sell these models. So I don't think it's okay to sell the game assets that you've printed and ripped, but I think it's probably okay to print them for your own personal use. If you're not making money off it, then what does it matter? Who's it hurting? So again, I don't know the full details of that. There hasn't really been any development in that space. I certainly didn't get contacted after making those videos, so who knows? But please do be careful and don't do this to try to profit off game assets because they're big companies, they have a lot more money than you, and even if they don't really have a case, you don't really want to get on their bad side by trying to sell assets that aren't really yours. The only thing that's a little bit muddy to me is stuff like this, where the game assets are being used as almost like a reference photo, and then it's been heavily modified. And this is detail that's been added in manually, and that takes skill and artistry to do. But it is based on a design from a game, so that's very muddy to me. I don't know if that's okay to sell or not. But there it is. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments in the description below. And thanks for watching. I really love doing this sort of thing. Again, it's where I first got my start on YouTube, is sharing really unconventional tutorials. Again, ripping files from the game. If you search that online, you still find those old videos 7, 8 years later because there hasn't been much stuff in this space. So it's something I really enjoy doing, and I hope you will find some value in it too, because here on Making Smooth is my aim to empower your creativity through technology. And yes, if you haven't noticed, I got a haircut. And if you don't like it, then deal with it. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.